Okay, last week we started studying Song of Solomon chapter 5. So chapter 4, we described chapter 4 with this description from Solomon regarding the Shulamite woman. It is describing her and how beautiful she is to him. And then this is kind of the segue to the wedding night as what's being described in chapter 5. Because when we come to chapter 5, here's the man's kind of description of this. But the biggest impact is going to be on the woman. And we see that starting here in verse 2. Fair warning, okay, up to chapter 4, I guess you could describe everything before is rated PG-13. Chapter 5 is getting a little bit more serious, so just so you're aware of that. There is a lot of symbolism here from verses 2 on through verse 10 and 11. This is there's a lot of commentators that take a literal approach to this. There's a sense in which he's actually knocking on her door and she's asleep, but her heart is awake. And then we see going down in verse 7, how that the watchmen, she's looking for her love, and they strike her, they wound her, they took her veil away from her, and so forth. This is not to be read literally, just as earlier in chapter 3. This concept represents her being a virgin, one of the daughters of Jerusalem. And as a daughter of Jerusalem, again, whether those were all of the virgins of Jerusalem or the virgins associated with Solomon, okay, wives, concubines, and so forth. This is a reflection of what's happening to her. And keep in mind the concept of virginity, especially in Solomon's time. In our modern day, it's not nearly as valued as it once was. But especially in Solomon's time, this carried with it certain status. It carried with it a recognition of the type of person that she was. And it kind of helps us to put it into perspective, like with what happened to Tamar and so forth, these events that took away that status. It was very, in some ways, traumatic, okay, because this was very important to society, especially as a Jew or as a Hebrew. So when we see starting in verse 2, Solomon has already described this wedding night, and not to say it wasn't as important to him because she spends more time talking about it than he does, but there's much more of an emotional impact that, again, Solomon's writing this, that Solomon wants to point out on the woman's part of this. And we'll see Solomon come back into this in chapter 6 and describing some different things. So starting in verse 2, I sleep but my heart is awake, it is the voice of my beloved. He knocks, open for me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is covered with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. Solomon, and again, this is coming from her perspective, she's asleep, but her heart is awake. Okay, there is this sense in which, this isn't literal, okay? It's the sense in which she is excited. Okay, remember back in chapter 3, we had the same thing, but it was the prospect of this marriage and the wedding night. Okay, we saw that whole marriage procession and so forth in chapter 3 and 4, and now here in chapter 5, we have her, she's asleep. There's a sense of kind of a deadening to what she knows is coming, and yet at the same time she's excited. It is the voice of my beloved. He knocks, open for me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. Again, we talked about this phrase, my sister, my love. It's just a poetic way of describing the care. There is for the aspect of my sister, that is this nurturing aspect to it. It has this sense in which we are in this relationship, we are together now, whereas my love carries with it the romantic side of that. So this isn't describing anything specific. This isn't something inappropriate. This is just a way of describing these two sides of their relationship, the familial relationship side and the romantic side. My dove, my perfect one. Again, this idea of a dove carried with it the sense of peace, of caring, of nurturing, and that's how he described her eyes. She will actually describe his eyes the same way, as being like doves. Then he says, for my head is covered with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. This kind of gives the impression of somebody who's been waiting, as if he's been waiting outside all this time. And now finally, there's this opportunity for him to be with her. And that is, of course, this waiting and waiting and waiting now because they have become married. Now they have this blessing in which they can enjoy together, being together on the wedding night. Verse 3, I have taken off my robe, how can I put it on again? I have washed my feet, how can I defile them? She's not describing the concept of leaving the house or her room or anything else. It's describing the fact she's married now. Okay, I've taken off my robe, how can I put it on again? So already there is this apprehension. Yes, there's excitement, but she's also apprehensive about what's going to happen. And so she's taken off her robe. She's now married. That robe is almost a sense of the sign of her virginity. That has been taken off. She can't put it on again. She has washed her feet. She can't defile them again. And again, it's not the sense, it feels like that would be backwards in the metaphor, but it's not. It's the sense in which she has now been prepared to actually consummate this marriage on this wedding night. She can't back out of it now. It's not something that she has, she can just say, oh no, you know what? I just changed my mind. I don't really want to be married to you. It doesn't work that way. Nor would she. Okay, nor she wouldn't do that anyway. But it's this conflict within her. Verse 4. So verse 4 and 5 is actually descriptive of the sexual act. And what's in a rare occasion. Okay, Garrett, remember I've described how Garrett and Zur takes a more literal approach. Garrett takes a more symbolic and perhaps more of a sexual leaning towards interpretation of things. I actually go a little bit further than Garrett does on this particular verses 4 and 5. So verse 4, my beloved put his hand by the latch, and my heart yearned for him. I'm going to omit the italics because the idea of the door, it carries with it a thought process that is more literal. And that's not the situation. Okay, because the actual concept of verse 4, my beloved put his hand by the latch, my heart yearned for him. One of the things that Garrett points out is because this isn't literal and it's figurative or symbolic, it is the recognition, as Garrett notes, that in poetry, especially of this time and really throughout a lot of man's history, the idea of a man's hand is associated with his sexual organ. And so this description, my beloved put his hand, his sexual organ, by the latch. This is speaking regarding the woman's sexual organ. And my heart yearned for him. Okay? There is this excitement. There is this coming to this point where now, all of a sudden, they are entering into the consummation and the sexual act together. And she has this conflict. Okay? She is excited. She is yearning for him. But at the same time, she's apprehensive, she's nervous, she's scared, and a little bit sad to a certain extent. Here in a little bit, we'll see how she's saddened by this. And verse 5, I arose to open for my beloved, my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the lock. So verse 5, she opens for her beloved. Again, this is the imagery of the actual sexual act. Garrett, when he reads myrrh, apparently myrrh was also, in addition to being very valuable and having a lot of other uses, it was also used as an aphrodisiac. And so when Garrett reads myrrh here, he reads it as symbolic of sexual excitement, just being excited, being enjoying that sexual act. I go a little bit further than he does on this, simply because of the imagery and the explicit nature of what's being described here. When I read verse 5, whether it's right or Garrett's right, either way, but I arose to open for my beloved, my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the lock. I think she's describing the bodily fluids that come along with the sexual act. I think she's associating myrrh, and of course that sense of the aphrodisiac, with the sense of the sexual act. And that's what's being described here in verse 5. All right? So verse 6, the sexual act has ended. Okay? So between verse 4 and 5, this is the sexual act. Verse 6, the sexual act is done. Any thoughts through verse 5 so far?
Are you saying this is right after they're married, or is it down the line?
No, this is their wedding night. Yep, this is their wedding night. Absolutely. Keep in mind, this isn't, the chapters of the Song of Solomon aren't chronological, okay? Because we know earlier, there's been references to the sexual relationship earlier than chapter 5. But this is her looking back, okay? Just as he looked back on their wedding and so forth. This is them kind of, the first couple of chapters introduce this love they have for one another. And then it's kind of like a flashback where they look back to their wedding, they look back to their wedding night. So there's no sense in which they have been involved in the sexual conduct before they were married, even though there were references to it in the first couple of chapters. It is a sense in which they're looking back now on when all this started. Anything else through verse 5? Verse 6, I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and was gone. She's not describing how that he just left or something like that. This is the sense in which this sexual act was done. Verse 6, the very first line, I opened for my beloved. That's the sexual act, but my beloved had turned away and was gone. My heart leaped up when he spoke. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer. So in this moment of this sexual act, yes, there's this excitement and so forth that she describes in verse 4 and 5, but there's also this sense of sadness in that she's lost something. Okay? And again, that speaks back to her virginity, the fact that she has lost this state. And this is a very traumatic moment for her. And it's something, and it's not that Solomon didn't care. It's not like he just abandoned her. I know that kind of seems how it comes off, but it's not. He can't help her with this. Okay? Her issue isn't with Solomon. Her issue isn't with anyone else. The issue is within her. Okay? This is a problem she's dealing with. She said, my heart leaped up when he spoke. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer. The watchmen, verse 7, who went about the city found me. They struck me, they wounded me. The keepers of the walls took my veil away from me. Remember back in chapter 3, she described this very same concept regarding the watchers, the watchmen of the city. And we described that then as being a reference to her virginity, the fact that the law and the marriage ceremony and so forth, this was all the means of protecting her, of keeping her safe, of preserving the state of her virginity. And now, notice how the watchmen have completely changed the way in which they're conducting themselves with her. Before, there was a nurturing sense of taking care of her and protecting her. Now, they're beating her. And again, this is not literal. Okay, this is the sense in which she's lost that virginity. Again, this is not something Solomon has abused her in some way. Okay, this is her dealing with these emotions and the trauma of losing that state. And you see that particularly there at the end of verse 7, they took my veil away from me. Remember, in the Old Testament, there were different types of clothing that represented different states in life, especially for a woman. There was the veil that a married woman wore. There was a different type of veil that a virgin wore. And then there was a different type of veil that a harlot wore. And so no matter what the situation in a woman's life, what she wore dictated and told everybody as to what she was, what state she was in. And so the veil of her virginity has been taken away, as what's being described here at the end of verse 7. So, anything through verse 6 and verse 7 so far? And again, this isn't Solomon being abandoning her or being mean or abusive. This is all thoughts within her, feelings within her that she's having to deal with as a result of the consummation of their wedding on their wedding night. Verse 8, I charge you. Now notice she doesn't speak to her beloved. Now she speaks through not even the other wives or concubines. She speaks to the other virgins, okay, of which she's no longer a part. She says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him I am lovesick. When she says lovesick, this description here, she's hurting. Okay, she's hurting, and it's an emotional trauma that she's dealing with, and she doesn't know how to really deal with it. She doesn't know how to talk to Solomon about it, and yet it exists anyway. And so she turns really to the only ones that she really knows, which would be the other virgins, the daughters of Jerusalem, or more specifically even the other wives or concubines of Solomon that were virgins. And as a result, when she says in verse 8, I charge you, if you find my beloved, tell him about this. Okay, explain this to him. Because she doesn't know how. She doesn't know how to put into words the feeling of loss that she has. It's not that it was a mistake. Okay, it's not that she's regretting having married Solomon. It's not the idea that I should never have done this. That's not the case at all. But there's this. It's weird. We all know how sometimes your heart can feel two conflicting emotions at once. Okay, we all know that. You know, your child leaves the home or whatever. You have both pride and anxiety, joy and sadness. The heart is capable of conflicting emotions, and that's what's happening here. All right, anything through verse 8 so far? Verse 9, the daughters of Jerusalem. What is your beloved more than another beloved, O fairest among women? What is your beloved more than another beloved, that you so charge us? This is a very important pivot, very important dialogue from what we typically refer to as the chorus in the song. This is the daughters of Jerusalem, again, whether this is all the virgins of Jerusalem or those particularly associated with Solomon, they're going to respond to her directly. They don't just say, hey, yeah, we'll go let him know. That's not at all the situation. They turn back to her and ask her a question. Okay, they're going to do the same thing in chapter 6. Here in verse 9 of chapter 5, they say, what is your beloved more than another? Okay, how would you compare him to any others? Oh, fairest among women. Okay, that phrase, they use that phrase on several occasions because that's how Solomon deemed her. She was the fairest among women. That's how Solomon saw her, and that's very important because Solomon himself referred to her as the fairest of all. So what is your beloved more than another beloved that you so charge us? They're trying to bring to her mind, okay, when you think about Solomon in this case, what do you think about? What is he compared to others? And notice the relationship tie-in of how Solomon saw her. O fairest among women. This is how he sees you. How do you see him? And this is very, of course, remember, Solomon's writing this, but for the sake of our dialogue here, this is a very wise thing to say from the daughters of Jerusalem. Because notice in verse 10, the woman comes back and says, my beloved is white and ruddy, chief among 10,000. Keep in mind, the way she describes him shouldn't necessarily be taken literally, okay? That his eyes, being white or whatever, his cheeks, spite. This is all figurative, okay? So when she describes her beloved as white and ruddy, chief among 10,000, he's strong and he's healthy, is the idea here. His head is like the finest gold. His locks are wavy and black as a raven. His head is, it's almost like you would say well chiseled. Okay, it's attractive. And then when she describes his hair, what is his hair not? It's not gray. Okay, he's full of life. He's young. He's not yet old. There's a sense of vitality, of vigor here. So in verse 12, his eyes are like doves by the rivers of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. Remember before when Solomon describes his love, he refers basically the same thing regarding her eyes. Her eyes are like doves. And we talked before that this is not so much of a physical descriptive concept, but more so they communicate. They are endearing. There's a sense in which she's kind of allured by them. She's pulled to them. And that's what Solomon said about her, and the same thing's being said about him. His eyes are like doves by the rivers of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. That washed with milk may refer to the eye. And so her focus would be on the actual, iris, or what is that called? The little circle around your eye, or in your eye? It's the iris, right? Am I right? Yeah? So that's what she's focused on. Okay, because that's, eyes are windows to the soul type of thing. Well, his eyes communicate, all right? In his eyes, she sees an attractive quality about him. All right, anything through verse 12 so far? Verse 13, his cheeks are like a bed of spices, banks of scented herbs. His lips are lilies dripping liquid myrrh. So verse 13, when she says, notice she doesn't say the same thing about the pomegranate, okay? She says in verse 13, his cheeks are like a bed of spices. And it's, again, this is not so much what he looks like, it's how he and his appearance makes her feel, okay? So the sense in which his cheeks are like a bed of spices, I tend to think of when somebody's healthy, okay, you kind of have color in your cheeks, all right? And not only that, but the sense in which those cheeks have a kind of a softness to them, all right? It's like a comfort. And that's how she's describing this. It's like a bed of spices. Not just, they're like spices. It's a bed of spices, banks of scented herbs. Okay, there is this sense in which his cheeks give her the feeling of nurturing, the feeling of something to be enjoyed, pleasure to be taken from. And then his lips are lilies, dripping liquid myrrh. And again, we associated myrrh earlier as having this aphrodisiac type of quality, and he had already described her lips as something that excited him as well. And so this sense in which, and of course the idea of kissing him carries with it this excitement and this sense in which she enjoys that part of it. Anything else through verse 13? Verse 14. His hands are rods of gold set with beryl. His body is carved ivory, inlaid with sapphires. Notice from verse 14 on through verse 15. Verse 16 doesn't really have too much of it. Verse 14 and 15, the emphasis now is on, there's the sense of valuable jewels, materials, in how she describes his body. So when she says, verse 14, his hands are rods of gold set with beryl. Again, there's not so much a descriptive phrase of actually describing Solomon. It's more in how it makes her feel. Okay, his hands are strong. There's a sense of rods of gold. Now, gold by itself isn't that strong. It's very malleable. But the idea of the value of them to her, the fact that they are rods, and there's a sense in which his hands provide a comfort and taking care of her, supporting her type of thing. His body is carved ivory inlaid with sapphires. Again, it's not that he was necessarily chiseled or incredibly muscular. Sometimes we might think of that because of the statues that in Greece and so forth. We think of stuff like that. That's not so much what she's describing as much as it is the idea of how wonderful she feels holding him. Okay, this is what she feels like it is. This is how much of a value she has in enjoying being with him and holding his hands. Verse 15, his legs are pillars of marble set on bases of fine gold. Again, she's describing him like a statue, isn't she? That's how she describes him. Now remember, when he was describing her, in many ways, he was kind of setting her up, so to speak, on a pedestal, right? Okay, he could not conquer her. She had to come down to him. Remember, he put her up on a mountain. Well, she's doing the same thing. Notice, set on bases of fine gold. Well, people don't have bases, okay, unless we're talking about feet. But the idea is that it's like he's a statue, all right? And it's something of, when you look at it, you think in awe, and you think of wonder. You think of, especially given the valuable materials she describes, I tend to look at this as the value that he has to her. Okay? Not just the fact that he was wealthy, yes he was, but this is what he means to her. So his legs are pillars of marble set on bases of fine gold. His countenance, and by countenance there is a sense of the face, but also the attitude. Okay? Throughout the Old and New Testaments, for that matter, the idea of countenance carried with it the expression, but more than just an expression on your face. It was the attitude and the general mindset that you had. So when she describes his countenance is like Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. Okay, she's not describing him as a angry person all the time. She's not describing him as a violent person or as someone who's constantly depressed or sad. But instead, his countenance is like Lebanon. And we've already talked about Lebanon as being a place where these wonderful cedars grew and how valuable a place. She doesn't say his countenance is like cedars of Lebanon. She says his countenance is like Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. Okay, she describes his countenance like the land and excellent as the cedars. Okay, this is this sense in which he's a joy to be around. Okay, she values being in his presence. It's not like something she dreads. She values being with him. Verse 16, his mouth is most sweet. Yes, he is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. So the daughters ask the question, first of all, anything through verse 15 before we get to verse 16. So the daughters of Jerusalem ask the question, who is your beloved? Okay, and remember how he sees you. He sees you as the fairest among all women. So now she thinks about him. And then when she responds, of course she's speaking to the daughters of Jerusalem here, but in verse 16, yes, he's altogether lovely. There's nothing about him I don't like. I love everything about him. This is my beloved, and this is my friend. And that's very important that she notes those two concepts or aspects of their relationship. Okay, he is my beloved. There is that romantic relationship that exists between them, and this is my friend. Okay, it's not just the fact that they're romantic; it's the fact that he cares about her. You know, he loves her, but also he referred to her as his sister. Okay, because of that friendship, of that relationship, that nurturing and caring that the two have for one another. So when she responds to the daughters of Jerusalem, and again, this is the wisdom of Solomon, and this is the wisdom of the daughters of Jerusalem making the statement that they did, in the midst of her trauma, in the midst of her sadness, they ask, why did you marry him to start with? Is he worth it? I mean, who is he compared to others? Is he worth the trauma of losing your virginity? And what she comes to the conclusion of is, yes, absolutely. And so in essence, they remind her of why she did this to start with. Okay, and reminding her of how wonderful her love is, of how much he cares about her, of how much that he wants to help her and be with her. And that helps her through this trauma. That helps her through this conflict within her heart. So in verse, and that's the end of chapter 5, in verse 16. Any thoughts so far through chapter 5, verse 16? Yes, ma'am.
I'm having a little trouble with this for some reason, thinking about Solomon, and very wise he is, but he's also multiple wives, concubines.
Yep.
How could this one just be picked out? And also, are these words from his point of view, thinking about himself, or has she actually said that? Because he's talked about the vanity of all vanities.
Right. Yep. So there's two different, to answer your second question, you have to figure out the first question. The first question is, is he writing this because of one particular relationship he has? If so, who was it? Well, we don't know who it was, okay? But if it was about one particular person, I'm guessing she is contributing to this song, okay? He's writing it, and he's writing his parts, but she has also expressed her thoughts, and so he's able to write those in, because that would be a little bit arrogant, I suppose, to kind of write himself in this way. You know, you could look at it that way. But he's writing this from her perspective, all right? So that's if there was a specific beloved of Solomon. I personally tend to think that if there was, God made no mention of it. He didn't deem important to mention it. But I think it's just as applicable if this was a wish, a deep-seated wish that Solomon had, that he had someone like this. It would put a very poignant, sad note to the Song of Solomon if, in fact, this is Solomon wishing he had a relationship like this. And in describing himself the way that he does, it wouldn't be arrogance. It would be, again, this is how she feels by seeing him. Okay? He's describing two people that are so in love with each other and have so much care and concern for each other that this is how they see, this is the filters that they have. But there's not a single thing that they would change in the other. And to me personally, it would add even more to the point of the song if this was Solomon wishing he had this type of relationship, because it adds more to the value that we all should have in our spouses. To recognize the fact that there are some people who wish they had this. Solomon, of all people, who could have added anything he wanted if he didn't have a relationship like this one and expressed his sorrow, really, in this way, that he doesn't have something like this. Really, it's almost like a message to all those who would read the song, value what you have. Because even Solomon, as powerful and as rich and as wise as he was, didn't have this, if that's the case. Yeah, Larry?
So Michael, as I read it, after he has sex with her, he left. He's gone.
That's a literal interpretation of it. Yeah.
And my Bible said, and was gone.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
then she saw him, and the watchman smote her.
Mm.
How did the watchman know who she was unless Solomon told him?
Well, like I said, verse 6, again, if we try to take a literal approach to this, even going back to chapter 3, if we look at this as he literally left, she's literally leaving her home, looking for him, it creates a lot of issues in trying to understand what's happening. And I tend to think that this is all symbolic, it's all figurative of this sense in which she has lost. Solomon, in essence, took away her virginity. He's gone, in the sense that emotionally she can't connect to him based on this. It's not like Solomon understands what a virgin is, from a woman's perspective. He can't relate to that. And so the way women, especially in this day and age of Solomon's time, valued that state of virginity, this was a deep trauma that she experienced. So she's describing it in this way, that he's gone. Not that he physically doesn't like her anymore. In fact, in chapter 6, chapter 7, he's still with her. Okay? But the way she describes it is, she wants to explain to him how she's feeling, but she can't.
He left.
Well, it's not that he physically left, but that emotionally he doesn't have he can't relate to this. He doesn't understand what it means to be a daughter of Jerusalem as a virgin. Okay, so again, it goes back to the differentiation between reading it literally, him leaving, because there's a lot of literal type language in chapter 4, in chapter 3, that doesn't make sense literally. And so that's why it all flows when you look at it from a figurative perspective of Solomon expressing his feelings and his beloved expressing her feelings. That this isn't so much any action or narrative. This isn't really a narrative at all. This is a flashback to remembering what it was like and the feelings that it evoked. But I agree with you. If you look at this from a literal perspective, then it paints everything in a very different light.
Right.
Yeah.
She said, I saw him, but I could not find him. That
Yeah.
tells me he left.
Well, she couldn't find any common ground.
No answer.
Yeah. Yeah, from a literal perspective, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, from a literal perspective, that's exactly what it would have been. He had sex with her and he took off.
And to my perspective, as he left, he told the watchman, don't let her follow me. that way based upon her. And she
Yeah.
tried to follow him.
That would be true.
Okay.
But it would not fit with his feelings towards her that we see later in these chapters. Because as we see later, he still loves her. He still cares about her. In fact, in chapter 6, his love has even deepened for her than it was before they had sex. So now it's even, his love for her is even greater than it was before. So trying to merge a literal interpretation with how Solomon continues to perceive her is very difficult if you look at it literally. But if you're looking at it that way, Larry, I completely agree with you. Yep. Anything else through verse 16, sorry. All right, we won't be able to get very far into chapter 6, but we'll get as far as we can here. Verse 1 of chapter 6. The daughters of Jerusalem speaking to, again, those pronouns, your, and again, fairest among women. It's not Solomon speaking. These would be the daughters of Jerusalem. Where has your beloved gone, O fairest among women? Where has your beloved turned aside that we may seek him with you? And notice verse 2, my beloved has gone to his garden, to the bed. And this idea of gone to his garden is coming to her. Okay, coming to her, and to a certain extent, once again, that sexual, or at the very least, that romantic being with one another, even if it's not going to the extent of the sexual act continuing. But this is how she describes this. He hasn't left, as of verse 2. He's still there. And so when she says, or when the question is, remember the question was before, okay, well, who is he? Okay, how would you compare him to others, considering how he sees you? And she talked about that. So where has your beloved gone, O fairest among women? Remember, before she says he was gone. He left. Well, where has he gone? Where has your beloved turned aside that we may seek him with you? Again, if we're looking at this from a symbolic perspective, and she's seeing this as an emotional turning away, okay, not so much that Solomon turned away from her, but that she couldn't really relate to him what she was going through. She responds with, he hasn't gone anywhere. And that's what all of this described earlier in chapter 5 reminded her. He is my beloved and my friend. Okay, he hasn't gone anywhere. And that's what you reminded me of, O daughters of Jerusalem, by asking me, well, who is he? Verse 2, my beloved has gone to his garden, to the beds of spices, to feed his flock in the gardens, to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feeds his flock. And again, he feeds among the lilies. That flock part, italicized, but again, going all the way back to chapter 1 and chapter 2, that concept is of being with her. Okay, remember he described her as lily of the valley. The garden, chapter 4, that's being with her. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up with chapter 6 next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.